all. Thank you for joining us for the AVITH in Context Towards Collaborative Service webinar. I'm Emma Nugent, Policy Officer at the Centre for Excellence in Child and Family Welfare. I'm joined by my colleagues Michelle Lonsdale, Carolyn Davies, and Pearl Goodwin-Burns. I begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. For me, it's the Wurundjeri land of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Just a reminder that today's session is being recorded. If you're having any technical issues, please use the chat box and Pearl will help you find a solution. There'll be some time for questions after the presentation today. If you have any questions for Elena, please use the Q&A function to ask a question. Elena Campbell is the Associate Director at the Centre for Innovative Justice. Many of you will recognise her name as being the lead author of the Pippa project, the report of which was launched in March of last year. This project looked at how the legal system responds to the adolescents who use violence in the home. Findings highlighted that legal systems are typically designed to respond to adult perpetrators of family violence. However, adolescents who use violence at the home are not equivalent to perpetrators of other forms of family violence. These adolescents experience significant mitigating vulnerabilities. Our last webinar with youth will emphasize that court systems don't allow time to fully explore this complexity. Practitioners are working with layers of complexity, their young age, being victim survivors of family violence themselves, a history of trauma, including intergenerational trauma, disability diagnoses, ASD is particularly common, issues with alcohol and other drugs, and issues with mental health. The Centre has been advocating for collaborative, intersector approaches that allow us to intervene much earlier. Today, Elena will be talking to us about today's theme of collaboration, implications for program design, and the Wraparound project. Elena and CIJ are leading the new ANROS-funded project, Wraparound Families Experiencing Adolescent Violence in the Home, to develop a framework for comprehensive support and earlier intervention. I will now pass to Elena to talk more about her work.
Thanks so much to Emma and to the Centre for having me along today. It's my privilege to be joining you from Boonwurrung country down on the south coast of Victoria and to pay my respects to Aboriginal elders past, present, emerging and any Aboriginal people on the call today. This is really my favourite topic to talk about. It's one of those issues that is in one way quite confined and targeted, and on the other way incredibly complex. We don't have a simple answer or response to this issue at the moment. So it's great to be able to be working with the Centre and a range of different other kind of bodies as we try and move towards a consistent understanding of what the issue is and a collaborative response to address it in Victoria. Now, I'm just hoping that I have I am going to be able to move on my slides. I was just realising because I was sharing, I wasn't quite sure whether it was going to cooperate. So what I'm going to do, I think there's an audience is joining us from a range of different experiences, disciplines, and awareness and exposure to this issue. So I'm going to sort of give you a bit of a context, wider context for those people joining us for whom it's sort of a little bit less familiar. But obviously there are some people who will be incredibly familiar with some of this work, and then I'm going to zero in gradually to the more specific project that I'm doing at the moment, as Emma mentioned, which is called the Wraparound Families Project. So essentially, for those sort of, if we zoom out for a minute, adolescent violence in the home, or AVITH, is often termed a range of different things across the literature and the evidence base. It's called adolescent family violence, child to parent violence, often in the European context. There are different descriptions and definitions, but the language and the policy settings are important in terms of how they shape the response that we impose. Generally, these terms are used to describe patterns of behaviour which reflect our understanding of family violence. So physical violence, emotional abuse, property damage, attempts to control other members through family members through the use of certain behaviours. And it's generally understood to reflect a certain set of circumstances. So throughout the evidence, including in the work that I've done, the majority of children who use violence in the home are male. although that's sort of to a different, sort of a lower extent in terms of the proportions, generally around 1/3 to 3/4, rather than the sort of higher rates we see in adult intimate partner violence, for example. By far, the majority of people who experience AVITH are female, generally often sole parent mums or mothers and children who've previously been exposed to adult intimate partner violence. That's generally sort of the most common context in which the issue arises, but it's not always the case, as I'll take you through in a minute. In terms of the policy landscape, and I think it's really important that Youth Law conducted their webinar a little while ago. For those of you who joined it, it's really important to understand the legal response. In the Victorian context, we have a very proactive family violence response, as many of you will know. We have an expanded legal definition, which has captured AVITH since about 2008. And police and court statistics that are gathered as a result tell us a certain story about AVITH. So there has been, since that time, there's been a consistent rate of police call-outs to family violence incidents involve adolescent respondents, around 10%. Slightly lower, but nevertheless consistent rate of intervention orders granted across Victoria involve adolescent respondents. And then we have experienced an increase in children and young people being identified as using family violence during COVID-19, which services often describe as a bit of a net widening, where kids who were not using harm before are starting to use it, or are experiencing kind of increasing in the frequency or the severity of the violence that they might be using at home. Meanwhile, in this context, the Victoria Police Code of Practice leaves little room for discretion in terms of what the response involves. So it recognises adolescents as vulnerable, but doesn't then explain what to do about that vulnerability. And police are required to bring an application for an intervention order where they determine that any risk is involved. And it actually specifically states in Victoria, which is different from other jurisdictions, not all, but many, that they cannot tell affected family members or victim survivors to apply for them on their own. So there's a sort of system driver bringing children and young people towards a legal family violence response, although family violence safety notices are not available for use against anyone under 18. In terms of the Royal Commission recommendations that are quite relevant, more broadly, the Royal Commission in its immense work over the course of only 12 months and 227 recommendations, there weren't a lot of dedicated recommendations looking at children's experience of family violence, although there were some really significant headline ones. So it is therefore significant that there were 6 recommendations dedicated to this particular area, and that there was a whole chapter of the report dedicated to adolescent violence in the home. So identifying that this is an issue that requires a considered policy response. And the recommendations at that time weren't necessarily about developing a considered policy response, because obviously they were just sort of doing what they could at the time, but recommended the establishment of specialist practitioners in the Melbourne Registry of the Children's Court, which there have been various iterations of it, but that's operating really well now. A legislated statewide diversion scheme, which has come into play. So when children and young people are come into the criminal justice sphere rather than the civil sphere, which is where intervention orders lie, then they can access support and diversion processes which are intended to be therapeutic and keep them out of the criminal justice system. Then those 2 things have happened, but then there were 4 remaining recommendations which have sort of happened to different extents. There was a recommendation that there be an expansion of Victoria Police Youth Resource Officers with a dedicated focus on responding to the use of family violence or violence in the home by young people. But the way that Victoria Police operates is that regional issues and commands and decision determine how resources are deployed, which does seem to have an effect on the extent to which those roles are focusing on young people using family violence or not in different regions. So that's sort of a little bit variable in terms of whether we can say it's actually been implemented. Then there were recommendations around combining AVITH-focused programs with youth group conferencing approaches, and that's sort of been evaluated, while there is also a really important separate children's court program run by Jesuit Social Services within the court, which takes a restorative approach to families coming through the court process. There's a recommendation that there be crisis accommodation options for adolescents using violence linked to therapeutic interventions. That has not occurred. I think there's certainly been an increase in the availability of crisis accommodation generally for young people experiencing family violence, but where kids are using violence and harm themselves, that kind of creates a situation where if they're removed into crisis accommodation and they continue to use the behaviours that they were using at home, that quickly escalates them into criminal justice system responses and gets them exited from the accommodation. So we still haven't really addressed that issue. Then there was also a recommendation for a statewide expansion of AVITH-focused programs, which I'll touch on in a little bit because that sort of had a range of different iterations or has panned out in different ways. In terms of the service landscape, there have been dedicated focus programs operating in three, funded by government, operating in three areas and then operating elsewhere for quite a considerable time. The programs that have been funded by government for a while are based on the Step Up program in the US, which is a combination of an accountability focus along the lines that you might expect in the adult sphere of men's behaviour change programs, combined with a restorative focus, because obviously where families are experiencing harm from their young person, they absolutely want the harm and the violence to stop, but they more than likely want the relationship to be repaired. And so that approach has been seen as a good way of sort of acknowledging what's been happening in the household, getting a young person to identify the harm they might be causing and also voice their own experiences, but also support parents to explain and acknowledge their experiences. And a lot of value has been recognised in the opportunity that is created through that space in the right circumstances for parents to feel that feel their experiences are validated, that they're not alone. Often this issue is associated with a huge amount of stigma and shame and therefore silence. So a lot of families experience harm from their kids for a long time before they reach the point of seeking support, because they feel that somehow it's a reflection on their parenting or that they've failed in some way. So it's really important that then that validation occur, but also people become equipped with different tools, because families will fall into a range of different patterns, which I'll kind of get back to in a minute. The challenge though with those programs is historically evaluations, both of the ones run in Victoria and elsewhere in the US, have found that it's very difficult to engage young people in the programs because it's modelled essentially on a turn up at the same time each week for 12 weeks in a row and talk about your feelings approach. And so while the Step Up program in the US is more effective at that because it is connected with the criminal justice system and it has the associated levers, there is still a range of issues around that a recent evaluation has identified as needing more, that their programs need to be equipped with a range of levers, roles, capacity for flexibility and things that I'll get back to in a little bit. There's also been incredibly long-standing services such as Breaking the Cycle, which is run by Anglicare for about 30 years now, and they use a really kind of intensive family systems approach, looking at essentially understanding the dynamics across the entire family and what might be contributing to essentially the manifestation of a young person using harm as a bit of as essentially the thing that rises to the surface that draws in the service system or the legal system's attention, but it's actually a reflection of wider issues across the family structure. There are also multiple services delivering therapeutic programs that are currently funded by government, with an injection of funding having come at the beginning of this year, partly in recognition of that spike in AVITH during COVID. But it was quickly rolled out, so there's been relatively limited guidance or parameters about how these programs should run, which mean that they've all taken a number of different approaches, which I'll get to in a minute. So now we're on to the Pippa project, which Emma mentioned before, was a multi-jurisdictional project funded by ANROS, where we specifically looked at primarily the legal response across 3 different jurisdictions, and compared the policy settings and drivers that meant that we were seeing certain things in some jurisdictions that we weren't seeing in others. So obviously I'll focus particularly on the Victorian context for this discussion, but it involved focus groups with over 150 different practitioners, and reviews of 385 legal and court case files to understand what was really the narrative that was sitting behind there's that sort of statistic of certain number of kids being identified as respondents to family violence call-outs or intervention orders. What we found, we went into the project hoping to kind of get a better understanding of prevalence, but what we found actually problematized that issue rather than clarifying it anyway, because we just found this huge range of complexity and diversity of circumstances and scenarios that meant that any kind of claim that we sort of a certain number of 10% of intervention orders or call-outs relate to young people using violence in the home is a slightly dicey claim to be able to make, because what we were seeing across the case files in particular was a range of things that went from some matters just didn't even meet the legislative definition of family violence, but we had nevertheless, police had brought an application and the court had granted an interim intervention order. Some matters met that kind of expected scenario that I referred to at the outset of that coercive controlling behaviour, or developed through social learning or replaying a parent's behaviour. Some matters involved just really serious co-occurrence of a whole range of issues, including young girls using particularly severe violence who had themselves experienced really significant trauma. Some matters involve family violence perpetration in multiple directions, and parents using intervention orders essentially is what was described by multiple practitioners as a quasi-parenting tool. So in terms of just feeling ill-equipped to be able to control the family dynamic themselves. But in those situations, even though the violence might be going in multiple directions across the family structure, including intergenerationally, the child was the only target of the legal system's intervention and the only one identified as the perpetrator, in inverted commas. Some matters, and this was the thing that really chilled us, involve parents using intervention orders as a form of perpetuating emotional abuse. So we know a lot about systems abuse in adult intimate partner violence, but this was something that we really didn't expect to see. But practitioners confirmed that they saw it quite a lot. This meant the system is colluding in violence being perpetrated against children. So this complexity is why I use the term AVITH rather than adolescent family violence, because in some situations what we're talking about is not use of family violence at all. Particularly, what we also saw that 50% of kids on court files had some kind of disability, and nearly 25% had been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder alone. And this is a real issue because the Family Violence Protection Act and youth law, the youth law webinar would have been referred to this, doesn't require any assessment of a respondent's capacity to understand or comply with orders. So this means that children for one thing, who are already have a lesser legal capability or are at various developmental stages, if you also add in cognitive or neurodevelopmental delay, are being caught up in a response that just was never designed for them. The other thing that we saw was the role of trauma in understanding children's prior and ongoing experiences and how they regulate emotions and behaviour. The use of adolescent violence is often just kind of one manifestation of the way in which kids respond to their own experience of family violence, and other kids will who've experienced family violence will present in different ways. What we also saw was trauma in the lives of parents being just as relevant in terms of their own response to their kids' behaviour, their interaction with service systems, with legal systems, family violence, child protection, family law systems, and generally a lack of service system support for these families. That it really meant the most common cry across the research was, if we're intervening in AVITH, we're intervening 10 years too late. So what kind of responses actually work? As we heard, legal responses are rarely helpful. The imposition of the intervention order sets up a path towards criminalisation, with kids very rarely having any understanding or awareness of what the order means or how to comply with it. Current service responses, as I said, often have to be, and this is not the fault of the dedicated practitioners working within them, have to be designed around a certain outputs which invite a compliance-based response, and repeatedly telling stories to an adult when a child may have never had a reason to trust an adult before. So there's an increasing recognition in the service landscape that these programs are not the answer if they're delivered alone, that collaborative responses are the only way to address the complexity of issues across families. Similarly, responses that enable development of trust and rapport over the longer term, because children have had a limited voice in this area, and so often programs get described, oh, it's very difficult to engage children, or they're very different to connect young people, and they're described by the Royal Commission as the silent victims or invisible victims, but they're highly visible suddenly when they become labelled as perpetrators. So what we found was that we really need to shift the emphasis from the idea of children as perpetrators, the fact that we've got to remember that they're perpetrators. Sorry, that they're children, they're not perpetrators. Perpetrators is a very unhelpful label to use. Since Pippa, we've been doing a whole range of different pieces of research. We're actually evaluating the program that Youth Law is running, the pilot program, and which was essentially drawing on that recommendation from Pippa about the need to get information to courts and more support to kids in place, including legal representation, because so often that experience of a young person is not presented to the court, and the court's making decisions blind. And courts themselves said, we want to know more, we want to understand what's happening in the young person's life. We're chairing an AVITH collaborative network involving practitioners from across AVITH service provision, but also legal services, family services, mental health contexts, police, because anyone who's coming into contact with this issue and wants to know more about how to respond to it. We're working or supporting the centre in its efforts to promote information and expertise, and it's really great that they're bringing together a community of practice for specific AVITH funded services. It's also fantastic that there's wider ANROS research stemming from the Pippa findings going on at the moment. Particularly, there's a study looking at that intersection of disability and use of violence in the home, being conducted by Melbourne Uni. So if anyone's been contacted about that, I encourage you to get involved. And Monash is also running a national prevalence study, which is really important, given that my comment before about sort of the fact that we're still really struggling to understand the rate or the prevalence of the issue of and what it is that we're trying to describe. And then specifically, this is the zoom in bit, what CIJ is running a sort of follow on from the Pippa project called Wrap Around Families Experiencing AVITH. And that's stemming from one particular recommendation that we made, that families experiencing AVITH really need a wide range of supports to address the risk and the co-occurring issues which exist across the family structures. And part of that is a case study of a particular program running at Drummond Street Services. But overall, we're aiming to establish a collaborative practice framework that can be used across different contexts, both in Victoria and nationally. So in terms of the emerging findings that are emerging from that, we are currently, we've just concluded and are about to write up the first stage of the work, which is essentially practitioner focus groups. And it's actually became a lot bigger than we'd anticipated. I thought that this project was going to be quite targeted, but because of the welcome injection of funding into this area by government earlier this year, it meant that there's more practitioners out there doing this work. So we were really keen to be able to talk to them about their different experiences in establishing their practice. And ANRO's very kindly accommodated us to do that. So what we've heard from those practitioners is, as you'd expect, as we heard from Pippa, that there are complex issues across the sort of family ecosystems presenting when an adolescent comes into contact with the system identified, for their use of violence at home. And it includes unrecognised disability and trauma in parents, which is a huge issue in terms of how services work with parents to be able to support them in managing their safety and the dynamics in the home. And it also includes recognition of the fact that many of the young people, many kids across the family structure might be experiencing a whole range of different needs, including mental health needs, a really significant one. And so some services gave us examples of facilitating support to a sibling where it may be prove a way to develop trust with a young person who is actually the focus of the intervention, but it was difficult to engage the young person themselves. We heard that there are still divergent views about, and actually potentially increasingly divergent views about whether to work with parents and or young people in a group setting. Some services had been doing that for a while and moving away from that approach and focusing their resources, which are, invariably limited, we all know in this sector, to case management and outreach. And some would say that they were finding that group work tended to be more effective where it was coming in the form of an earlier intervention, whereas others are really finding that group work, particularly with parents, was really, really effective. So there was a really very wide variability across practices there. What we heard was absolutely that there was this common scenario where, so I think I mentioned earlier about the Pippa findings, that often a common story was that families had just not experienced no service support at all. And what we were seeing was sort of either all or nothing, where families had either had no service system intervention or were completely immersed in the service system. And where it's the latter, the big challenge is that there are multiple practitioners often involved in care teams that are around the young person, which you would have thought was a good result. But it becomes like a full-time job for the young person and the mum, or invariably mum, who is supporting them, to kind of engage with all those services and to try and develop a trust or relationship, particularly if there's a turnover in workers. And the question that was often put by practitioners who were trying to develop particularly their AVITH practice, because they'd just been recently funded, was that often, despite the fact that there were many disciplines in the room, they were often the only one actually advocating for the child, and that there was also a challenge with that many people involved. Sometimes they felt that they had to step away or just perform a secondary consult role. We also heard that there was tensions between a disciplinary focus. So sometimes there can be an approach, well, a bit victim blaming, or mum's, let this go too far and mum's just got to put more boundaries around it and that will be all right, on the one hand, and on the other hand, a very punitive focus on that child or young person. And sometimes that really can present a real challenge when services or programs have been working really hard in a particular frame that is often, our family violence system is set up invariably to be quite binary. It's a dichotomy of victim survivor on the one hand, perpetrator on the other, where a young person who is vulnerable by the very nature of their age and developmental stage, potential disability, and their status as a victim survivor is also using family violence themselves, then that kind of, those dichotomies and those binaries start to collapse, and it's really hard to know how to respond and maintain a focus in that setting on that young person as a child and their vulnerability. More broadly, we saw that there were really big system challenges, and I think I went in sort of looking for how do we get towards a collaborative response. But one of the things we heard was that we still don't have a consistent service response, in part because we have a lack of a consistent understanding about what AVITH is and what it requires. And so services spoke about having to explain, not just to external services, but to their own organisations, why support for clients needed to happen over the longer term, as one example, or why brokerage was required often, or why flexible working or outreach was required. We also heard about a difficulty across the system in identifying AVITH. So if you don't know what it is that you're seeing when families present to us an organisation for service support for another reason, then referral pathways can be challenging. But they can also be challenging if your own service is not funded for a very long time. So if you work really hard to develop relationships with police, for example, so if you're coming across kids in this situation, send them to us. If that police officer who may be working really hard in, the youth resource officer role or whatever they're doing, knows that you're not necessarily going to be there because your funding's coming to an end, that's going to present a real problem. They're not going to want to set things up to fail. They're going to look elsewhere. As I noted before, where multiple services are involved, including in care teams, there's a real question about who's taking the lead and who's coordinating the response here. And on top of that, the newly funded programs generally seem to only be funded to work with young people. So essentially really the opposite of what we're talking about in the wraparound families approach, so that it meant that agencies needed to draw on other practitioners within their own organisation to support parents, and where they couldn't do that, it just couldn't occur. So often they were then withdrawing because they were saying, look, we actually can't be of assistance within sort of this really limited time frame we've been given. But overall, the different approaches that have had to be developed in a really short period of time has meant that we've got different results emerging, which in turn complicates the evidence base. There's no clear evidence base emerging. You can't have a clear evidence base emerging when you're all doing different things. There's also been, understandably, as we've all been lurching from and clawing our way through the last 2 years, there's been an absence of opportunity for dialogue between service providers to share their approaches and perhaps identify, oh, this works for me, how do you do that? All right, let's develop consistent approach. So it's great that, as I said, that the centre's setting up that community of practice, which is kind of separate and complementary to that collaborative network, which has a wider systemic focus in addition to the practice focus. And this is the final slide, and then I'll ask for questions just to let Emma or Pearl know. So I know that, you know, at the moment there's a lot of services responding, and particularly over the last few years, 2 years, when families have been presenting just to whatever service support they can get, and presenting in perhaps far more acute crisis than they were before, as I was referring to that sort of net widening and the increase in severity and frequency with which kids might be using harmful behaviours. So people are looking for, what can we do? What can we do when we see this issue when it comes to us? And we still haven't landed that in Victoria, but there's a hell of a lot of activity occurring that means that we might get there relatively soon, I hope. There's a marin practice guide that is still in development. There's been various iterations. The challenge there is around, as always across this area, is how do you address the fact that a family is experiencing harm and at risk from a young person's behaviour at the moment, while guiding a conversation potentially with that young person about their use of harm when they're highly likely to be a victim survivor themselves, including of current violence. Remembering that even often the scenario will be sole parent mum, kids at home, but the original perpetrator of adult intimate partner violence is off on the sidelines, and sort of this invisible influence, including through ongoing family law matters, which can have huge impacts on kids' behaviour, or they're likely to have learning delays or cognitive impairments. So for families where their child has a cognitive delay or an ADHD or ASD, and they're using harmful behaviours, there's not family violence otherwise present in the home. Families will often be desperate for service support but fall through the gaps because they don't sort of meet one or the other. And so families in that situation are even less likely to want to be able to invoke the legal system response and potentially criminalise their young person, or risk the removal of either their young person or their younger children by child protection. As I said, young people engaging with services are unlikely to have a reason to trust or make disclosures. So developing trust and rapport takes time. Assessing the presenting needs and risk factors across the whole ecosystem. Remembering that what you might be seeing is the consequence of family violence, not rather than the sort of cause. It's and a story of a lack of system support for trauma or other family challenges. So it's really important that everyone's getting secondary consults, bringing in other services and disciplines, and not trying to do it alone. Remembering that we've currently got a family violence response system that was designed for adults. So imposing it on children will potentially cause further harm. We need to always proceed with caution and understand what it is that we're dealing with, and that because AVITH is by its very nature an issue of vulnerability. So it's one of those things that we have to hold two truths in our hands at the same time, that we can acknowledge the harm caused to families by a young person's behaviour, while remembering that the person who's caused that harm is in need of significant support themselves. And I think it's time for questions.
Hi, Elena, it's Michelle Lonsdale here. We do have a few questions for you. Thank you so much for that. That was so interesting. And in particular, I think your highlighting of the nuances and the complexities. And you've just made that so accessible. So thank you very much for that. One of the questions has been asked in two different ways, so I'm just going to combine them. And that is, given that you have highlighted in your research the nuances, and you've talked about why the term AVITH, how do we build understanding of those nuances and complexities in those parts of our service system where we still talk about adolescent family violence? We look through a family violence lens.
It's a really good question. I don't think there's an easy answer because there's been so much activity over the last 5 or 6 years in trying to escalate and bring everyone to the sort of same understanding about the significance and the harm caused by family violence in general. But when we're talking about that, we're generally kind of referring to adult intimate partner violence, and yet we sort of collapse everything else that we see into that analysis. So it's really difficult to ask people to have done that hard work. So now, yep, right, we've got it. Now we're paying attention and it's really, really serious and we're going to deal with it this way. And then suddenly say, oh no, but this thing is different. And it's more complicated and it's more nuanced. So I think it's about really continuing to have not rushing things. I think not just kind of relying on statistics and rolling out funding and saying quick, we've got to make sure that we're doing lots of activity. A lot of the time we mistake activity for effectiveness. So we've got to create spaces where people can, and opportunities for those conversations for services to come together a lot more and talk about what they're seeing and the challenges for them, to have relationships across their service system networks. So different regions, of course, we know have different responses and approaches that are partly dependent on the different programs that are available and the different individuals working in those programs. They need the opportunity to talk about how do we approach this, and is this consistent with the way in which other areas are approaching it too. So that's not it's not a concrete, easy answer, but I think we've kind of gone a little bit full tilt. There was nothing, and then we went full tilt at quick, let's do lots of things, but we didn't stop to ask, what are we doing? What is the thing that we're doing, and what are we doing it to? We didn't sort of establish first what is our understanding of this issue. So I think that there's a lot of scope for that work to occur.
Can I just ask you about the influence and impact of the Pippa report? You mentioned a few research opportunities that have come up following that. Is there any influence or impact that you can see from the report in terms of language or practice approaches?
I have been amazed and really kind of both humbled but also a little bit alarmed that practitioners have taken it upon themselves to read the whole Pippa report, because it's massive. It's a massive piece of ANRO's peer-reviewed research, and that you know, it nearly killed me to finish. So it's been, the point being that it has been great that there has been engagement at that practice level, but sometimes that sits in tension with what practitioners are being asked to do. So where Pippa says you've got to work with the whole family, and you've got to look at the issues occurring right across that ecosystem, and you've got to remember that the child might be experiencing current violence, not just past violence. But then the parameters that you've been given for your program mean that you can only work with a young person, and you can only work over the short term if you've been given a sort of ceiling of a certain amount of hours, and your program itself only runs for the short term. Then that creates a bit of cognitive dissonance. Like, what are we doing? What are we doing? Why does this say one thing, but we're supposed to be doing the other? So that has created that's an interesting challenge that I think we need to reconcile. And yes, it has been really encouraging to see the recognition of disability and the role of trauma get picked up. And I suppose one of the challenges, or the limitations, is that I think there was a bit of momentum for looking at or interest at looking at legislative reform around that Family Violence Protection Act, and considering people's capacity to understand and comply with orders that might have got off the ground, but COVID derailed it. in the way it derailed so many other things. But it's got a lot of, I've been contacted by a lot of practitioners and services working around Australia as well, because as many of the challenges that we have in Victoria, where a lot of jurisdictions are sort of further behind in terms of being able to have this kind of conversation. Like, what is it that we're dealing with? How are we going to respond? So often programs are going it alone and looking for resources or frameworks to apply.
That leads very nicely into one of the questions, which is, I'll read it out. Boys who step into the role of father perpetrator after the father's removal can be re-traumatising for the mother and the younger children and affect their healing. What national supports, so not just Victoria, and research are available in this space to help address this re-triggering and older child removal and treatment?
Yeah. Now, that's a really interesting question in that it is absolutely the case that for so many women experiencing or living with their child using adult violence in the home, they carry their own trauma from their experience of adult intimate partner violence, and then when their son in particular starts replaying the behaviour that he saw dad use, it's not just the distress of that behaviour and the devastation that your own child is using harm and that your relationship is being ruptured. It's also you're re-experiencing all the trauma that you had experienced before. So it's like double the effect. It's a compounded effect. So what that really means is a few things. It means that we need to get better at understanding the importance of recovery for women and children when we step in and intervene in adult intimate partner violence. Because at the moment we do this thing as a system where we say, all right, we'll step in, we've sent you, we've removed you through an exclusion clause, or we've imposed an intervention order, and there might be family law proceedings going on, but we've separated you, so it's all over, rather than going, okay, actually now that's when the work actually begins in terms of supporting mum to recover and identifying that kids are going to invariably experience all sorts of consequences from their exposure to that violence. It might not manifest as in their own use of violence, it might manifest in a whole range of other ways. But often it's just the fact that where kids use violence themselves, they become very visible. That sort of idea of that child is trouble rather than troubled, the quiet, retreat, the depression, all the other manifestations that we see. So we need to get, as that sort of harbours back to the refrain from Pippa that if we're intervening in AVITH, we're intervening 10 years too late. We need to get in sooner and recognise. And that includes where women are connected with specialist family violence services for their experience of adult intimate partner violence, thinking about what that's going to look like, could potentially look like for how things are going to kind of the trajectory for that family. Sometimes it doesn't take long. I mean, I've heard pretty horrendous stories of where throughout the research where families, women will kind of flee to a refuge, and the children might not have been using harm prior to that, but the patterns across the family are so entrenched and so sort of significant that night in the refuge, the eldest son steps up and starts using behaviours that he's seen dad use, because it's sort of like, well, that's what happens. Someone's got to do it. So it can, which of course presents a huge issue for the refuge space, because how do they respond to the fact that they're trying to protect women and children seeking safety, but sometimes the kids coming in might be using all sorts of behaviours that include use of harm themselves. So it's a real, it's definitely a real challenge in terms of what's happening nationally. I think there's a, I can't say equivocally, I can't sort of point to a particular thing. I know that the work that has an AVITH focus is particularly increasingly focused on the recovery needs of mothers, including work in Queensland, the Renew program. But more broadly, I think there's an increasing focus on recognition on the profound harms that are caused to children by their experience of family violence, and how we need to give that greater emphasis, which we sort of, we've flagged on that in Victoria too, in terms of the Royal Commission recommendations to that effect. We sort of did a lot of other activity, but have only just now getting back to that as the implementation monitor has identified.
Even at the centre as a peak body, we've had people ring us or email us and ask us for advice, and we're not in a position to be able to do that, but advice about what do I do with a 5-year-old or an 8-year-old that is starting to show aggression. And like you said before, that early help, that early assistance or support is so critical.
Well, I think we've got to stop being surprised by it. Like, I think we've got to understand and expect that this is really potentially what's going to occur. And it might not be, it might occur as incredibly disruptive behaviour at school, or it might occur as use of violence at home, or it might occur as retreating into their, like, there's a whole range of different ways that kids who have experienced trauma will present, but we've got to expect and be ready for it and get in early, rather than just kind of say, oh, this has started happening. Oh, now what do we do? Yeah.
There are 2 questions about specific cohorts of young people. One is around, can you provide further details about girls using sexual violence, and what does this look like? Is it, risky behaviour or being violent?
That is a very interesting question in terms of using sexual violence. Our research hasn't sort of shown up particular rates or pointed to sort of particular prevalence of using sexually harmful behaviours, but it's certain, and it's a bit of a interesting contested area where kids using sexually harmful behaviours generally will often receive a quite therapeutic response through the system, because it's sort of seen as a separate thing, even though we understand that sexual abuse or sexual is also part of family violence. So we sort of haven't quite landed how we see these different issues. But responses to sexually harmful behaviours or sexual abuse, sexual assault, tend to be quite sort of clinical, whereas the family violence system has developed in a community-based response and sort of through a political narrative. So we then approach what to do about them quite differently. But generally, I think across the pattern, the gender breakdown of use of violence in the home more generally, what you tend to see is girls using kind of different tactics against mum, less so against dad, because you got to remember that where you're using violence, it's because you actually feel like you have some power. You're not, so kids will go to separated dad and be as quiet as a mouse, and then come home and pay out on mum or siblings. So that's the other thing in terms of the experience. This is obviously sexually harmful behaviour is usually happening against siblings, but where girls are using more acute forms of physical violence that may include that sexual violence as well, it's generally because they themselves have experienced profound trauma, profound sexual abuse themselves, profound neglect. So we certainly heard across the research about some really, really serious examples, including where with kids with disability and learning delays, where that's kind of really their understanding of what intimacy or connection is, because that's what they've had done to them. So there's a sort of a range of levels of nuance within there that, again, I just don't think we've even begun to address.
Just checking on the time. How much? We've got just a couple of minutes. Okay.
So, yeah.
Elena, we've got quite a lot of questions still. So what I'm thinking is, I wonder if the centre could kind of pull those together and maybe send them to you, and somehow we can get those responses back to all the attendees today.
Yes, of
because there are
course.
some terrific questions, and there's such interest in the research that, like, just the research is generated.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
So, all right, well, we'll collate those questions and responses, but I think Emma is going to finish up.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Elena, for such an informative presentation. This is such a complex space where comprehensive support is crucial in responding to AVITH, and you provided such a valuable discussion on implications for program design through a collaborative lens and how programs can work to provide these comprehensive supports and interventions. Thank you for all our attendees for attending our second webinar in the AVITH in Context series. There is a link to our feedback survey in the chat box. We'd appreciate it if you could complete it, as it helps to inform our future webinars in this series. We will also follow up in the coming days with the recording of the webinar and an information pack for your reference. Thank you once again for attending, and have a good afternoon.